Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in Cuba. Now imagine that you tuned in to your daily episode of Joe Blogs and you were met with this. Well, that's exactly what's happening in Cuba right now because there has been a nationwide blackout going on for the past 48 hours. And unfortunately for Cuba, this isn't the first nationwide blackout. In fact, it's the fourth that they've had in the past 6 months. And the situation is actually getting worse. Now imagine if you didn't have any electricity, and I'm not talking about just for an hour where we do these 1 hour global blackouts where everybody pretends that we don't have electricity and it's all quite fun. You get the candles out and the kids all get excited and everybody switches the TV off for 1 hour. I'm talking about if you don't have any electricity at all for 48 hours. And unfortunately for a lot of people in Cuba, this is now becoming a regular occurrence because Cuba simply can't generate enough electricity to feed all of the 10 million people in the country. And the way that the authorities are handling this problem is by announcing lots of different small blackouts all over the country on a daily basis. So in Havana, the capital, it's common to have 4 or 5 hour blackouts. And if you live in the provinces, then you might have blackouts of up to 20 hours per day. And if you think about your daily life, everything that you do probably has some sort of reliance upon electricity or power because you can't do anything on the internet, and we're all obviously totally addicted these days to the internet, so you wouldn't be able to watch YouTube, for example, or do any business, or do any Zoom calls, or do your accounts, or do anything that you probably take for granted on a daily basis. But more importantly than that, you wouldn't be able to refrigerate your food. So any food that you had that was fresh would go off within a pretty short space of time. If you rely upon electricity for cooking, then obviously you wouldn't be able to cook anything and you wouldn't be able to put on your air conditioning unit. And in Cuba, that is a real problem because it's in the Caribbean. It's a hot country. So people are literally sweltering. And the problem that Cuban people have is that the Cuban authorities simply don't have enough cash to be able to buy in enough fuel to keep the electricity running, because in the 80s and 90s, the Cuban authorities thought that it would be a good idea to set up electricity generating power stations using oil. Now, the reason that they did that was because historically, Cuba had a very strong relationship with the Soviet Union, and Russia and the Soviet Union had an abundance of oil, so they were happy to give Cuba lots of free oil in exchange for other things. But obviously, when the breakup of the Soviet Union happened at the beginning of the 90s, Russia was thrown into economic chaos, and so that free oil dried up. Now, luckily for Cuba, Venezuela stepped in when the Soviet Union stepped back, and it's another communist country, so it had an affinity with Cuba, and it was supplying lots of oil to keep the power stations running. But unfortunately, Venezuela now has problems of its own. Since Nicolas Maduro took over as the president, it's been sanctioned by the USA, and so it's no longer providing anywhere near enough oil to keep Cuba's power stations running. So the Cuban authorities have a real problem, and obviously they're facing significant sanctions from the USA, which would have been its natural trading partner 70 years ago before it decided to go all in on the communist ideal. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about Ground News, who I've been working with for the past 2.5 years and who I've partnered with for today's video. And they're offering Joe Blogs viewers an exclusive 40% discount on their Vantage plan, which is what I use. And what's brilliant about Ground News is that they're a news aggregator. They bring together stories from all around the world. And if we look at the articles that Ground News has pulled together talking about the Cuban power failure, you can see that they've located 233 different articles. And what's brilliant about Ground News is that they tell you whether those media sources lean to the left, lean to the right, or come from the centre, which is really important to me when I'm trying to provide a balanced perspective. And Ground News are offering Joe Blogs viewers a 40% discount on the Vantage plan, which you can access by scanning the QR code on the screen now or clicking in the link in the description below. In order to try to address the problems with the supply of electricity, on November the 26th, the Cuban authorities published this document, which is commonly referred to as Decree 110. And the underlying ethos in that document is that all major consumers of power, either electricity or other forms of power, have to convert to using renewable sources. They need to find at least 50% of their electricity from renewable energy, and they have to pay to invest into that infrastructure. So this is obviously a major challenge if you're running a business in Cuba, because not only are you struggling to actually keep your business running because there's not enough electricity on a daily basis, but now you're being forced to buy equipment, either solar panels or wind generators, to produce 50% of the electricity that you need. So this is doubling down in terms of the problems that a lot of Cuban people are having, because they don't have enough money to keep their businesses operating, and now they're being told by the authorities that they've got to spend money to invest into future electricity generation because the Cuban state simply don't have enough cash to be able to do it on their behalf. And alongside the requirement to generate your own electricity, there were also strict rules introduced to reduce the amount of electricity that everybody was consuming, including the shutdown of high consumption equipment such as electric ovens, air conditioning systems and refrigeration equipment, which have to be switched off during peak hours unless it negatively impacts stored products, so basically food. A restriction on the use of public lighting, meaning that only necessary lighting to ensure road and pedestrian safety would be allowed. A reorganisation of water pumping to the population to avoid operating during peak night hours. An adjustment to the temperature of air conditioning systems to a maximum of 25 degrees Celsius. A reduction in the use of installed lighting systems to 50% of the installed capacity, and a requirement to turn off all electronic devices at the end of the workday. So you may or may not agree with some of those restrictions, but the most controversial thing that was introduced by Decree 110 was that the Cuban authorities now have the authority to introduce blackouts of up to 72 hours. So they can switch off the electricity system for 3 days. And obviously, as we've just discussed, that is going to cause chaos, not just for the people of Cuba, but for the businesses. If you're trying to run a business and you're told that the power in your area is going to be off for the next 3 days, what are you going to do? Basically, all of the companies in Cuba now need to have their own generators, not just solar panels and wind. Realistically, you're going to have to buy an oil-powered generator because you need to know that that power is going to work, whether it's sunny, whether it's nighttime, whether the wind's blowing or not. So what this is doing is putting a huge burden onto all of the companies within Cuba to buy all of this equipment. And obviously, that's a really big problem. If you don't have the available cash flow, you're just going to have to ride with the punches. You're just going to have to take it as it comes. And if the electricity gets switched off for 3 days, then you're just going to have to stop doing things. And obviously, this is a disaster from Cuba's perspective because it needs its companies to actually be operating, making money, making profit in order to pay people, to give people employment so that they can spend in their local markets and also to grow the GDP of Cuba. Basically, what we are seeing here is a country that is in a state of complete collapse. I'm often asked, what does a state of collapse look like? Because obviously all of the people still live in Cuba. There are 10 million people living on the island. So what does a collapse mean? Well, this is exactly what it means. If your authorities can't produce enough electricity to keep the lights on and to let you be able to do things, then obviously it's very difficult to be able to go to school if you've got no power. If you need to go to hospital, it's going to be very difficult for the doctors to be able to do anything. If you've got a serious problem and they need medical equipment which require electricity, unless that hospital has its own generator and enough money to be able to pay for the fuel for the generator to keep its own electricity system running, then it's not going to be able to use any equipment that requires electricity. And if you think about when you've been to hospital in the past, everything is run by electricity. There are beeping monitors and lots of different pieces of equipment being wheeled around places. If you need an x-ray or if you need surgery, then you need lighting for that surgery. You'll want to keep air conditioning on to keep the doctors cool while they're performing surgery on you. So this is an absolute nightmare. If you think about just driving around on the roads, you take things like traffic lights for granted. They keep everybody safe. If the traffic lights are switched off in the whole of the country, not just one set of traffic lights, but every single one, then it's going to cause chaos and potentially accidents. Now, just to make matters even worse for Cubans, Donald Trump has decided that he's introducing a travel ban for a variety of different countries. And there's going to be 3 different levels to this travel ban. Yellow, where countries have 60 days to prove that their problems could be sorted out, and if they can, then maybe those countries will be taken off the potential travel ban and visa restriction list. Orange, where the countries are basically going to face severe restrictions. So basically, if you're from that country and you want to travel to the USA, it's going to be much more difficult to get a visa to do that. And red, where there's basically going to be an outright ban on the travel of any people from that country going to the USA. They simply won't be given a visa. And this graphic shows which countries have been classified as red, orange and yellow. And if we look at the red countries, you can see that there are 11 countries where the citizens are going to be totally banned from travelling to the USA. And they are Afghanistan, Bhutan, Iran, Libya, North Korea, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen, and Cuba. So what that means is that if you're a Cuban national and you were thinking about leaving Cuba, going to the USA either to work or visit family, just to get away from what's going on at home, to get some light relief, it's now going to be impossible. There is absolutely no way that you can travel to the USA legally. And I think what this is likely to do is increase the amount of Cubans who are traveling to the USA illegally. Now, obviously, that's a big issue that Donald Trump is trying to clamp down on as well. But basically, it's making it much more difficult if you're Cuban living in Cuba to go to the USA. It's now going to be very, very difficult to do that. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been following what's going on in Cuba for more than 3 years now, and the situation has got continually worse. But the current position whereby the authorities simply don't have enough fuel to be able to provide electricity to the people of Cuba is an absolute disaster. Now, this is something that we've been following. We've been looking at the electricity system, which is in a state of disrepair. It was built in the 1980s, but unfortunately, the Cuban authorities simply haven't been maintaining all of the equipment. So it's old and decrepit, and it breaks down on a regular basis. And that's a problem in itself. But the other major problem is that it requires oil to fuel those power stations. And oil is one of the most expensive forms of generating electricity. If you were sitting down and working out how you were going to build your electricity grid today, the last thing that you would come up with is making oil-powered generators, because you would be paying an absolute fortune. Unless you're in Venezuela, maybe, where you've got lots of available oil which you can use from your own wells. But Cuba simply doesn't have enough. It only generates enough oil to feed about 40% of its needs. So it needs to import around 60%. And in the past, it was able to balance the books by getting some free oil from the Soviet Union or Venezuela. But that's not possible at the moment. And Cuba doesn't have enough friends to be able to help it out. Certainly the USA, which is its closest in terms of proximity, is not a friend. In fact, there's lots of sanctions in place that are hurting the Cuban authorities and the Cuban economy. So Cuba is now at the point where it doesn't have enough electricity to be able to feed all of the people. And that is a major problem if you're running a business in Cuba. If you don't have electricity, you can't switch the lights on. You can't actually do all of the things that you need to do. So this is basically putting Cuba back to the dark ages, where it's going to have to come up with other ways of creating things and making money. And obviously, from an international point of view, it's difficult to be able to make things to export. Firstly, they've got the sanctions in place. But secondly, if you don't have any power, it's just not feasible to be able to do that. So the Cuban authorities have come up with this plan to try to solve the situation. But basically, that plan has told everybody to use less power. So that's not really solving the fundamental issue. And it's also telling Cuban businesses that if they're using a lot of power, they're going to have to generate at least 50% of that from renewable sources, and they're going to have to pay for the equipment themselves. So that's putting further pressure onto those companies at a time when they're already struggling because they haven't been able to make enough things because they didn't have enough electricity. So this is really a very vicious circle from Cuba's perspective. And if you're a citizen living in Cuba at the moment, it would be an absolute nightmare, because you don't know from one day to the next whether or not you're going to be able to switch the lights on, whether your food is going to spoil if you've got it in a refrigerator, what you're going to do in terms of cooking, and in terms of having a nice time and maybe putting on the TV or charging up your phone or things like that, that everybody in the world now takes for granted. If you think about if the electricity was switched off for 3 days in your country, what would you do? Particularly if it came as a surprise, if it just happened. You got up one morning and it was completely gone. You might not be able to charge your electric car or your phone or your tablet or log on. If you're working from home, you wouldn't be able to actually communicate with anybody in your company. You wouldn't be able to do those client meetings or talk to your friends or family or children, keep the kids entertained. It would be an absolute nightmare. And that's what's happening in Cuba right now. And the problem is, there doesn't look like there's any end in sight. This is a fundamental problem that is going to be very difficult to resolve. So the overall summary of today's video is that the situation in Cuba is getting worse. The power is now failing on a daily basis. We've had planned blackouts, but these blackouts are now lasting for more than 24 hours. We've had lots of these over the past 6 months. The situation is deteriorating, and unless somebody comes in with a major plan, unless Cuba can get its hands on a huge amount of capital, it's not going to be able to replace those aging power stations. And so it's likely the situation is going to get worse during 2025. And this is now becoming a real crisis for Cuba, not just an economic crisis, but potentially a humanitarian crisis. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much. That really means a lot to me, helps to keep me going, and here's something to put a smile on your face.